talks like this. She talked really slow and softly and made me feel super nurtured. And it got to the point where I would just want to go over her house because I just felt safe there talking to her. And one of the things that Rebecca and I were able to do for each other is that I brought her a little bit of urgency and a little bit of sophistication when it came to business type stuff. And she brought me a way of being that was sustainable. I got the better half of the deal. I'm just saying. So her learning from her land and her wanting to be so deeply respectful of the people that worked for her and the people that she was supporting ensured that she was being in a way that was actually regenerative. The No Regrets Initiative. Sally Calhoun and team are beyond inspirational to me when it comes to modeling a way of being.
Oh.
That deserves a clap. Y'all can go ahead. One of the reasons is because when we first started talking about no regrets and regenerative asset management strategy, I said, okay, cool, how do you make decisions about who you invest in? And Esther said, well, we ask, is it beautiful and is it complex? Okay. Well, how do you know if you got the best return on your investment? Well, we look at if it inspired joy and if it added complexity to the landscape and did well by the people. For real? And they have all of the technical stuff sitting underneath that because they want to make sure these businesses are profitable. But my point is that there is a difference between context and content. This is super key to the ethos behind our business and how we do work. What I mentioned in the beginning about moving from a place of scarcity and what we focus our attention on, of course, pain and trauma and suffering and all of the things that are happening with the earth, they exist. We can't turn away from them. But if that is our context and not our content, what we are going to be building is pain and suffering and loss. If our context is complexity and beauty and abundance and joy, then we are resourced enough to be with the content of pain and suffering and loss in a way that actually transforms it into what we want. And the No Regrets Initiative holds all of that when it comes to money. They are modeling how to heal the economic system that has extracted from the earth and has extracted from people with their investments. And I am just so glad I get to participate in any part of that. So I want to move now to us. That was about organizations and systems. But what about us as people, as individuals? When I talked about grief and loss and pain, that's a lot easier to connect to sometimes individually. A very personal story when it comes to this is when I talked about drunk climate scientists in DC, I also had an equivalent experience when it came to being a person of color, when it came to being a woman of color. In my identity as a social justice activist, I would tell these stories over and over again about African Americans being descendants of slaves and about how I am the product of generations of rape that just resulted in me. They were breeding pairs that made it because my ancestors were brought here as property. I have a master's degree and a bachelor's degree in African American studies. I could go all the way down the rabbit hole when it comes to the torture that produced the engine of the economy in this country. But that was my context for my blackness for a long time. And that was a part of what corroded me. And on a deeper level, I'm gonna get real vulnerable with y'all. This was not a part of the speech, so go with me for a second. Also the way that I was engaging people. was from a context of scarcity. Because my context was about the pain and the suffering and the trauma that produced me, I couldn't engage with other people without a lens of trauma and pain and potential exploitation. Everyone was an opportunity to potentially exploit me, especially white folks, if I'm being super real and super clear. And that meant that I couldn't actually see a person when I was talking to a person. And that meant that I wasn't able to connect. And that meant that I was getting increasingly unhappy, increasingly combative, and I was not producing the kind of movement building that I wanted to do to regenerate the earth or regenerate people. So a part of inner composting and a part of fertility, inner fertility, I wasn't going to talk about personal cover cropping, but after that previous presentation and all of the nuggets and the gems about cover cropping, I have to talk about this. So personal cover cropping. How much of you is exposed in a way that's encouraging brittleness? So just like the land, when we have no defenses, those of us that feel too vulnerable all the time, we're eroding, we're hardening, and we're losing our drive and motivation. And one of the things that really got me was that splash erosion is worse than tilling in the last presentation. And if you think about that from the perspective of interpersonal interaction, microaggressions and the small daily traumas that we go through can be more eroding to our spirits than those big conflicts that we can remember. That's a key factor of personal cover cropping. But then how do you protect yourself and still be able to receive? Too much protection is like concrete. Nothing gets in, like care, so then nothing grows. All that activity that happens underneath the soil in real life, not in real life, but underneath the soil, the literal soil, that's the soil of our brains, our imagination, our creativity. And when we're too protected from connection, we lose our imagination. Nothing grows. So a solution to this is to outcompete destructive thoughts. Instead of using a bunch of pesticides, now sometimes pesticides and insecticides are necessary, and this is a whole other rabbit hole about medication and different really serious interventions we need to do when we get too intense with our need for personal cover cropping. But without all of that, we can just slowly start to inject enough positivity and outcompete our internal drive to be destructive. And this is not just some woo-woo stuff. In my day-to-day, I do executive leadership coaching. I see this happen, and I see how it erodes organizations from the inside out. And I see how it takes leaders out that really need to be there and really need to be sustainable. And this next piece I'm going to talk about is what happens if you don't do this work and you still remain in leadership. So then we get to inner composting. Personal cover cropping is one strategy, inner composting is another. The two components of a compost heap, browns and greens. Browns, carbon, greens, nitrogen. One way that I'm feeling and thinking into that is browns being collective trauma, the big, hard pieces of work, and greens being the just day-to-day trauma that happens all the time, the little conflicts, the tension, etc. I see it as a mixing bowl in my head. So when I experience a little hit or a twinge, I imagine it being thrown into this compost pile inside my brain. I know when it's time to stop adding things and it's hitting the thermophilic place, when I am so hot that I'm leaking all over the place when it comes to destruction. I'm snapping at my husband, I'm yelling at my kid, I'm doing all of the things that let me know, oh, I think my cup's full. Even the phrase, my cup's full, my compost pile is full, it's time to not add anything more. I need some space to work this out. It's when we're at our edge. It's when our literal heat, because that's what anger can feel like sometimes, reaches its peak. And what's needed at that thermophilic place is air and water. I think of air as time, and I think of water as care. We need to step back and take the time to do the work, not just keep going, and we need enough care, water, to create liquidity and make sure that the heat is being distributed. One thing about this is that the larger your internal pile, the more help you need turning it, right? So you need more support, the bigger your pile has gotten and the more time it's taken for you to get to your edge. You know that you're in the curing phase when you're cooling down and able to have new thoughts and do new behaviors that you couldn't tolerate before. Things that you were too defensive or too on edge to be able to do. That's when you know your compost is actually starting to come together. And when it's done, some of those chunks, some of those browns, those carbony, woody pieces, they're still there. Those are memories of trauma that no longer trigger you into bad behaviors, but remind you that healing is possible. Those are the things that are inoculated with all the fungi and the bacteria that will contribute to your healing process in the future. And the finished product is meant to promote growth. Some examples, I'm not going to go deep into this because a lot of it's really personal, but in my coaching practice, I have had the honor and the privilege of coaching farmers. And I call it an honor and a privilege is because I do not underestimate what it takes for a farmer to set aside the time and the resources for personal development work. It's mostly been with women, and they've been at their very edge when it comes to being mothers, wives, and farmers at the same time, and not knowing what to do to maintain all of that. There is a dear heart who is here who I actually heard it referred to as inner ranching. And it feels like it's the same concept. When we get to our edge, what do? And I have seen so many ranchers and farmers do this work and come out the other side of it. And that has been an honor and a privilege. And we need more of it. So to recap, fertility is a framework that can provide inspiration for any area of life. What does it look like to create the conditions conducive for life and then leave it alone? What does it look like to not create these organic monocultures in our businesses and with our actions, but instead be creating ourselves as fertile beings so that we build fertile soil and fertile ecosystems? When it comes to diversity, invest in your people for their inherent value and not just what they can do for you. And I'm going to extend that and say invest in yourself this way too. So if you do end up becoming a yoga teacher or going into real estate, that's okay. You have inherent value. You still care. And you will return back into the fold when you're ready. Learn the tangible skills to integrate discomfort and invest in the diversity of individuals to create just enough friction, not too much. And then give that diverse team infrastructure that allows them to get real with each other so they can solve their own problems. That's what high performance looks like. When it comes to inner composting, create ongoing space for the work. It's happening all the time within you, whether or not you make space for it. If you don't make space for it, you might get a little smelly. You might start to rot. You might become that nasty ass compost pile that nobody wants to touch. But if you're in leadership, people may not tell you that that's who you are. You're just going to go around being destructive and not know it. That's really what you don't want to have happen. And really actually pause if you want to do this work when you're at peak heat. Don't just keep going and don't just keep adding things. And then remember to sift at the end of your internal composting process so that you can distinguish between what's being totally broken down and is now your rich, fertile compost and what's still there. those brown chunks that are now healers instead of being traumatic. All of this is about building community. I'll restate what I said in the beginning around the fact that we are the soil of the movement. It's on us. And my goal is for each one of you to care for yourselves in this. And for you to know that you're worth care. So that the way that you're being with the soil, the way that you're being with your teams, the way that you're being with your animals, the way that you're being with your families is fertile, is regenerative, and that you have joy as you do this work. I feel really blessed that I've been able to create this in my own life. And now I want us all to be able to create it together. Thank you.